unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. One of the most reliable laments about Indian defense policy, heard from critics both at home and abroad, is that the government of India spends far too little on defense. Experts say this is a problem for at least two reasons. First, India lags behind many of its strategic competitors when it comes to spending, which only deepens the country's asymmetry and capabilities. Second, without greater investment, India won't be able to live up to its own rhetoric of becoming a leading rather than a balancing power on the world scene. Joining us to talk all things defense policy is Sushant Singh. Sushant is the deputy editor of the Indian Express newspaper, where he writes about national security, international relations, the judiciary, and investigative agencies. Before turning to journalism, Sushant served in the Indian Army for 20 years, including multiple stints in Jammu and Kashmir. He is the author or co-author of two recent books, Mission Overseas, Daring Operations by the Indian Military, and Note by Note, The India Story, 1947 to 2017. He's currently on leave in the United States, where he's a visiting lecturer in political science at Yale University. I am pleased to welcome him to the podcast for the very first time. Sushant, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Milan. Thank you for having me here.
It's good to see you in the United States. This is a big topic, and it's hard to know where to begin, so let's just start by getting some basic facts straight. How much does India actually spend on defense as a share of its GDP? As I've come to understand, there's this number which gets quoted around that India spends around 1.5% of its GDP on defense, although you were telling me earlier that this isn't a totally accurate number.
So there are two numbers which are thrown around. One is the 1.47, 1.46% of GDP, which is the usual number which you hear, and the other number is 2.05% of GDP. And the difference between the two numbers is primarily the defense pensions budget, the pensions which are paid to defense pensioners, and slight amount which are spent by the Ministry of Defense. Now, the whole question of defense pensions, are they part of defense budget or not, is a vexed question. In India, till the mid-1980s, the defense pensions were considered to be a part of the defense budget. But as it shot up to around 3.54% of GDP during the Rajiv years, they were taken out, primarily to reduce the number and make it look better than what it is. But in the recent years, the defense pensions have been more or less included in the defense spending, which is also what SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, does when it counts the numbers.
I mean, assuming this figure of around 2% of GDP is close enough to the truth, I guess one question that our listeners probably might be interested in is, why should defense spending matter to anyone who is not a defense policy wonk? What does this number, 2% of GDP, actually tell us about where India is headed? So
essentially, why defense spending is essentially the question, why armed forces or why military? In an ideal world, there would be no armed forces and no military. The bigger answer would be, why does India have the military? So of course, to protect its territorial integrity, to safeguard its own sovereignty, to ensure that internal security and rule of law prevails in the country, to get the kind of position in the global committee of nations that it desires. That would be the more larger answer. But to a more prosaic answer would be, how much India spends on defense also determines how much India spends on its development. It's a classic butter versus guns debate in a sense. If India tries to spend more on defense, it would be spending less on development, and that is why it matters to every single 1.3 billion Indian.
So I want to understand a little bit about what's going on inside of the spending. So as I understand it, there's sort of three primary categories of what India spends when it comes to defense. The first is sort of personnel, human resources, which is, salaries, pensions for retired service members, operating costs, which is just the day-to-day of keeping things going, and then new defense acquisition, right? Buying those new capabilities and hardware and so on. When you look at the current budget, how are things situated within those three buckets or those three categories of spending?
So if you look at the budget for the current financial year, which is the financial year 2019-20, which started in 1st of April because of the India's financial year and finishes on 31st of March, the total spending by the Ministry of Defense is around $61.5 billion. And it depends on the conversion rate. If the currency improves, it would look better. Out of this, pensions is actually 16 billion.
Wow.
So 61.5 billion is the overall defense spending, out of which 16 billion is the pension, which is quite a significant number. And the equipment acquisition or capital procurement budget is actually $15.4 billion. So India is spending more on pensions than it's spending on capital procurement. The total operating cost, including the salaries and pensions, is around 30 billion. That's how the budget.
One of the early challenges the Modi government faced soon after coming into office was this long-standing demand that had been made on the part of former servicemen for the government to enact a policy known as one rank, one pension. And I think the idea here is that, service members should receive the same pension for the same rank and for the same length of service, irrespective of the date on which they retired. After a lot of back and forth, the government finally relented, implemented the decision. What impact did this have on the defense budget? I mean, did this essentially blow the retirement and personnel budget out of the water?
Not exactly. It had an impact of around 8,500 to 10,000 crore rupees, which is not an insignificant number, but not really blowing it out of proportion. I think, but this coupled with the fact that a new pay commission came in, and the fact that the number of pensioners in India, defense pensioners in India, is increasing with the increasing lifespan. The fact that military personnel serve for far shorter period than what civilian employees, non-military personnel serve for. So India currently has around 3.1 million pensioners on its defense rolls. 3.1 million people are actually being paid by this thing, and this number is increasing by the day. People are living far longer, so this number is increasing. And unlike civil services pension in India, which over the last 20 years or so, 19 years or so, have become contributory, that you contribute to the pension and you earn that pension. The defense pensions in India are still government paid. They're state guaranteed in that sense.
So you mentioned that military officers serve for shorter tenures than civilians. Has there been any serious discussion of, say, raising the retirement age so that people can serve, sort of longer?
Yeah, Milan, that's a good question. And I believe there was this proposal which was informally mooted and also formally mooted in the ministry last year, considering that the pension budget were going out of hand. And a proposal was mooted that could we extend the service for 2 years, both for officers as well as for people below the officer's rank. But eventually that would have also meant that there would be no recruitment, no employment taking place in India. And as you know from the latest NSO report, that the youth unemployment in India is around 23%, 22.6% or something for people under 25 years of age. And considering that, it would be a disaster if there was no further recruitment.
So I think sometimes these debates can sound pretty esoteric and in the weeds for ordinary Indians and ordinary observers of Indian domestic affairs. But what are the real trade-offs going on here? I mean, there was a story Bloomberg put out just a week or so ago which said, the Indian Army is going to reduce the number of sniper rifles it purchases by something like 70%. So by having this ballooning personnel costs and being not able to spend as much on defense acquisitions, what are the things that the Indian military is actually losing out on? So let me make 2 points here. One is, Milan, we must realize that as a percentage of GDP, whether we call it 1.45 or 2.05, whatever we may call it, it is at its lowest ever in India's history, even lower than 1962, when India lost the major war to China. That is one. And number two, while we are spending as a percentage of GDP far lesser, it is skewed towards HR costs. Those are the two fundamental points. And because of this, as you gave this example of the sniper rifles, where the army had signed a contract and the army had to go back on the contract and say we're cutting it down by 70% because it just doesn't have funds. So the biggest hit that is taking place is in modernization. That the armed forces are not getting modernized fast enough, and that imposes a huge challenge because India is in a neighborhood where there's China, there's Pakistan, there's all kind of challenges in the Indian Ocean region that are coming up, and even if India were to maintain its own position in the region and take these challenges, it would need the military strength. And Milan, as you know better than me, it's not that the military is meant just to fight war. The fact that if you do not have the military strength, you could actually be inviting war. As the famous philosophical argument for war goes, war only happens when two countries do not agree on each other's relative strength.
and war ends when two countries actually agree on their relative strengths. So I think that's one fundamental challenge India faces with lower defense spending.
So as we face this kind of fiscal challenge, there is right now the 15th Finance Commission going on. This is a body that looks at all the central government tax money and decides how it's going to devolve those funds to India's states. The center has reportedly asked this commission, whose report should be coming out pretty soon, whether there should be a separate mechanism that would essentially fund defense and internal security. Now, for obvious reasons, this has raised the hackles of many state leaders who believe that, you're going to earmark defense funds, and that's going to come at the cost of money that's supposed to be devolved from the center to the states. What's the motivation behind this move, and is it likely to go through?
See, essentially, the motivation is very clear. Motivation is that the India's national security, India's defense needs more budget, more money, and that money is very difficult to pull out of the current budget. Just to indicate, as of now, with the kind of lopsidedness and the amount of money, 32% of India's central government, that is the federal government's budget, actually is spent on defense capital expenditure.
Wow.
32% of India's federal government's capital budget is actually spent on defense capital. Anything more, if you were to do, you would actually be not making any infrastructure and doing nothing else. Right. 32% is quite a significant number. So it's not really possible that the government of India should give more money and more money would come in and that would happen. And primarily the reason why the addendum was issued to the terms of reference to Finance Commission was to actually carve out a new mechanism, a new way for which for national security and internal security, if I remember right, both for the Union Home Ministry and the Union Defense Ministry, find out a kind of carve out a new piece of pie in the between. So the pie for development under the federal government, under the central government remains intact, and a new pie is created, which, as you say, primarily will probably come more out of the states than out of the federal budget.
But if you read the sort of think tank reports, we are after all sitting in a Washington think tank. Many analysts of India's strategic behavior insist that India's got to spend at least 3% of its GDP on defense if it wants to live up to its own strategic rhetoric. Sushant, what you seem to be telling me is that this is not even remotely a realistic objective, at least in the near term.
Absolutely. 3% would mean you are already paying salaries and pensions to the number of people that you have in uniform. You are already running the army well. You have the operating costs, they're training, they're doing everything else. Where will the money come in? Money will come into capital expenditure. Capital expenditure, if you're already spending 32% of capital of your federal government's capital expenditure on defense procurement, you would be increasing it by what? Another 30-40%? So 70% of India's central government's capital expenditure would go on defense, and only 30% of development.
Right, and that 30% is going to roads and bridges and
everything
ports
else. So
and highways.
Milan, you remember that when Pakistan became independent for first 4 years, it did not devote a single penny to development. It devoted everything to defense out of its central budget. So if we in India after 70 years of independence, 71 years of independence, 75 years, 72 years of independence, would not be wanting a situation where it's spending more on defense than on development.
But there's this old saying, right, and you hear it almost every week, either on social media or on op-ed pages, that the best foreign policy for India is 8% growth. Do you agree with that? Because if you grow the pie, then these things are more possible. Maybe not 3%, but you could increase expenditure on roads and you could increase expenditure on defense, right? You could have the guns and the butter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is fundamentally the answer. The answer, eventual solution, there's only one solution. Higher economic growth, better quality of economic growth. That would increase the pie. So even a 1.5% of GDP or a 1.6% of GDP would go far longer than what it goes now. And second, of course, is the share of federal budget as a percentage of GDP. That has been declining over the past few years, whether due to the taxation collections coming down or for whatever reason, or maybe more production is happening in private sector. Somehow, I think that needs to be stalled at some point in time, where the central government or the federal government or the government as such, both the share gets more as a share of GDP than what it is currently getting.
So I want to just focus a little bit on the defense acquisition capabilities part, because that's something that, particularly for our international audience, to the extent that they focus on defense, they often talk about this. Our friend and colleague Dhruva Jaishankar, who's at the Observer Research Foundation, has written in a piece that, India essentially aspires to do three things at the same time. We want to acquire high-quality equipment, we want to do so at a low cost, we want to do so in a short time frame. And he's basically said this is kind of an impossible trilemma, that you can only do 2 out of 3 of these objectives at any point in time. Explain why.
So essentially, Dhruva puts it very clearly and very lucidly that you want high quality military equipment in short time frame and at a low price. So essentially, all three things cannot be met. High quality equipment is in short supply. It would only with a few people. Not everybody would have it. Defense equipment in any case is a very specialist kind of kind of equipment. And because it's specialist kind of equipment, they are monopolies mostly. It would not be available at a low price, and especially if you put a time bar that you want it immediately. So what happens in most of these cases is, as has happened with India historically, there's a crisis. Then India goes and buys more expensive equipment, high quality equipment at very high rates, but in the desired time frame, because then you are pushed down by a crisis or by an emergency, and that is a trilemma which cannot be fulfilled unless Indian defense production indigenizes, and India is able to create that kind of research and development and indigenization, which would allow it to do it internally without going to a foreign supplier.
Well, let me ask you about that, because India is often hailed as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, importer of defense equipment. But politicians have long held, including this government, that it must indigenize its own defense production. Are we any closer to that reality in 2019 than we were, say, 20 years ago?
Honest answer would be no. We're not really, despite all the attempts to build a strategic partnership, make in India, and so on and so forth that we have heard about in the last 5 to 6 years. Realistically, not much progress has been made by India. And just a matter of fact, India is now the second over the last 5 years, as per SIPRI data. India is the second largest importer. The Saudi Arabia is the number one importer of defense equipment and weapon platforms in the world. And compared to China, China is now in number 3 exporter of defense equipment. It actually exports defense equipment. And Milan, you will be surprised, the biggest importer of Chinese military equipment are 2 countries in India's neighborhood, Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Wow. Now, what does this mean for the United States? Because we're often told that the U.S. and India have this very deep and broad strategic partnership. There's an economic track. There is a defense strategic track. The economic track, as most people know, is going through, some fair degree of headwinds, but the defense strategic track seems to be going forward, at least when you look at military exercises or mill-to-mill partnerships. But if some of these issues related to defense acquisition, procurement, budgets are not resolved, does that essentially put a ceiling or a cap on how deep the U.S. and India can work together? Because, you're talking about getting things at a low cost, high quality, short time frame. To what extent is the U.S. going to figure into that?
Yeah, Milan, I'm sure you stay in D.C. in a think tank, and you hear it more than me than here out here in D.C. And what I have heard is clearly a kind of frustration with the Indian system, with the Indian government, for not being able to take this partnership to the next level. Of course, a part of that frustration emanates from not identifying China as a common threat, etc., etc. But a large part of the frustration is what many in the U.S. establishment believe is an unreasonable Indian demand for higher technology without having adequate safeguards and not signing enough contracts. The Indians believe that the Americans would want them to buy everything from the Americans, not from Russia or France or Israel. And so it almost seems to be like it's not like that there's a lack of trust or people can't work together. It's just there's more frustration and more irritation between the both sides about this. It is an irritant which needs to be removed. Whether it needs structural reforms on the Indian side, whether it needs a kind of better understanding by the Americans of the Indian mindset, Indian approach, and the Indian need for strategic sovereignty. This will need to be worked out. Otherwise, it can be. I don't want to call it a pitfall, but it can be problematic in the future. The kind of voices, the kind of noises I've heard in DC are not very helpful.
So I want to kind of take us forward a little bit. The media has reported that the government of India is finalizing a new national security strategy. It's been prepared under the leadership of the National Security Advisor. What do we know about what's in the document, and what bearing do you think it's going to have on this question we're talking about today of defense spending, defense allocations?
The national security strategy, to the best of my mind, there have been 3 attempts to produce a national security strategy in the last few years. There was an attempt in 2007 where the Integrated Defense Staff produced a national security strategy and gave it to the government, which was not released. In 2015, Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, he was heading the NSAB, and they gave a draft national security strategy to the government, which was again not released. Last year, there was a national security strategy prepared, as you said, by the Defense Council, headed by the National Security Advisor. And there has been a belief that a part of it would be made public. And as per whatever has been reported in the media, it is the same media reports that you have seen, I've also seen, actually say that that this would, in a certain sense, redefine the kind of threat that India faces. Because so far, India has believed that there's a two-front, collusive, simultaneous threat from China and Pakistan that the Indian military has to be prepared for. If the simultaneous part is taken away, that you don't have to deal with China and Pakistan at the same time, it would mean that you don't need to have whatever. The Air Force doesn't need 42 squadrons of fighter jets. The Navy doesn't need to be a 200-vessel Navy. The Army does not need 4 strike corps, because then probably you can move your forces from here and resources from one front to another front. That would be a big shift, because that would mean that the shortfalls are not as glaring as what they are. But that would mean, that we are banking on that there would be a complete redefinition of the threat perception and the role, which has been there for last 57, 58 years now.
Let me ask you about something else with an eye towards the future. We know that the government has moved many additional troops to Jammu and Kashmir to keep the peace in the wake of Article 370. Do we know how many troops actually have been added over there, in addition to those that might be, guarding the line of control?
I don't think there were any additional army personnel moved to Jammu and Kashmir. The confusion occurs because of the paramilitary forces, or the Central Armed Police Forces, as they are officially called, being mistaken for the army. So the army has people on the line of control, which have always been there, and has the Rashtriya Rifles, which look after the rural and the semi-urban centers of the Kashmir Valley, and also in the Jammu region and in Doda region. As far as the paramilitary forces, or the CRPF, CAPF, BSF, etc., CISF is concerned, I do not remember the exact number, but I think it's around additional 50 to 60,000 paramilitary forces personnel was sent to Kashmir after 5th of August, or around, there were 40,000 in one go and 50,000 in another go. That's what the numbers I have read. My colleague Deeptiman Tiwari in the Indian Express had reported them.
Do you think, though, even if these aren't paramilitary forces, given the heightened sense of security threat, the changing realities on the ground, that this could be used perhaps as a pretext to argue for more resources for the armed forces? That, we are likely to see, people can't quantify exactly, what the threat might look like, but an uptick in incidents, given that Pakistan and groups that find safe haven in Pakistan might want to retaliate against the Indian measures.
Yeah, that's a good question, Milan. Actually, yes, that could be put out as a pretext, as a reason for more funding, for better equipment. But I'll turn the question around a bit. In an ideal world, you would not want the army to be deployed on internal security duties, whether it is in the northeast or in Kashmir. So whatever those numbers are, if those duties can be handed over to the paramilitary forces, to the police, local police, then you can actually downsize the army to that number, bringing down the HR cost and the skew which is towards the HR cost, towards the salaries and the pensions bill. That skew can actually be fixed to some extent if the internal security duties were to be fully taken over by the paramilitary forces and the local police forces.
Let me end by asking you a question that I asked Anit Mukherjee, our common friend who was on the show a couple of weeks ago, who's written a brand new book about civil-military relations. And one of the points that Anit makes in his book is that there are a shockingly small number of elected politicians in India who have a military background, way smaller than you'd see in the United States, in fact, by orders of magnitude. Do you think that there is a disconnect between civilian leaders and the military in terms of what the military sort of needs, what its requirements are, the shortfalls it faces, the dramatic trade-offs it must make in terms of balancing, personnel costs on the one hand and acquisitions and capabilities on the other?
I would not believe so. I remember Mr. Parikh, after Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, Mr. Parikh became the defense minister after a few months. And I remember meeting him off and on during that period. Unfortunately, he's no more. And he rather quickly picked up. Within, I think, 3 to 4 months, he picked up what the defense services needed or what they did not need. He understood them, and as you know from your own experience of talking to people, most Indian prime ministers, at least in our memory, going down to Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, everyone, Narasimha Rao, they have been able to understand what the requirements are, what is needed. But they have made political calls. They have made calls which are very political. They have made choices which they have known, whether Mr. Vajpayee and Brajesh Mishra or Dr. Manmohan Singh and Shiv Shankar Menon. They know what they were doing when they took those calls. So while it is true that they do not come from a military background, but I really do not understand that serving, let's say, like Anit served as a major, I served as a lieutenant colonel, would it make a difference if we were to become political leaders? Because politicians have to make far more policy decisions than this thing. But in this government, General VK Singh has been a minister for the last 6 years. He was a former army chief. Rajavardhan Rathore, who retired as a colonel, was a minister, not in this government, but in the previous government, previous Modi government. So we have had people. I'm slightly conflicted about the idea that only people who have served are better placed to understand the military or deal with it. That does not mean that people who have served cannot understand it. Just one Singh being a fantastic example as somebody who understood it. And as a common friend, I won't name him, says that if serving in the military is a requirement for understanding the military, then is being a terrorist a requirement for understanding a terrorist? So
you don't want to make any breaking news by announcing your transition to politics on this show. I think that's the message that I'm getting.
Yeah, absolutely, Milan. I have no such desire to be caught in the whirlpool of politics.
Thanks for coming on the show. It's great to see you, and I hope that you've enjoyed your time at Yale and look forward to your regular reporting in the pages of the Indian Express.
Thank you so much, Milan. Thank you so much for having me here.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.